Brent Struthers, Director of the Secure Telephone Identity Governance Authority, otherwise known as the STIGA, and I'll be your moderator. So give it about 30 seconds and we will get started. All right, let's get started. But before we get started, I want to cover a few ground rules. During the discussion, I encourage you to submit any questions you may have, but using the chat feature on the webinar controls. We're going to hold all the questions until the end of the presentation, and then we'll try to get to as many of your questions as possible. In addition, both the slides and the link to an audio presentation and recording will be distributed by email to everybody who registered. We're also going to send out, toward the end of the presentation, a poll to all the attendees to gauge your interest in some future topics. So now I'm going to introduce our speakers. The first speaker will be Dr. Eric Berger, who's currently on detail to the FCC as the Chief Technology Officer. Following his tenure at the FCC next October, Dr. Berger plans to return to his role as Director of the NSF Security and Software Engineering Research Center at Georgetown University. Eric has graciously agreed to join us to outline the problem and its scope. Then we will hear from Jim McEachern. Jim is ATIS's principal technologist and one of the chief leaders in the development of the Shaken protocol. So I think we're ready to get going. Eric, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Brent. And before I get started, I do want to thank ATIS and particularly Jim McEachern, who you're going to hear from in a minute, for their dogged work on this issue, and especially since I see a number of people had signed up, the participants in the Robocall strike force, as well as the carriers, vendors, academics, and individuals who've been participating in the Internet Engineering Task Force's STIR work group and the ATIS SIP Forum IP-NNI work group, which for those who don't know, that's where Shaken has been developed. So the first thing I wanted to address, something that some people sometimes ask me is, does the FCC care about robocalling? And the answer is an emphatic absolutely. Robocalling is the #1 consumer complaint at the FCC. In 2018, we got over 200,000 reports at consumercomplaints.fcc.gov. And I'll be honest, I didn't even know that there was a consumer complaint portal. So without much advertising, we got a high volume. And again, that's consumer complaints, one word, .fcc.gov. We also know that there have been millions of reports to the Federal Trade Commission. And we hear that this is a big issue, if not the #1 consumer issue at the Department of Justice and at the state level. Every commissioner at the commission cares deeply about robocalling. I mean, we are people too. We're personally inundated with calls. And, when I tell people what I do at the commission, every family member and friend jumps in saying that, we've got to fix this. And personally, it's the chairman's #1 consumer issue. And this is basically the principal issue that brought me to the commission back in 2017 was things that we could do to ameliorate robocalling. So if you look back, what have we done about robocalling? We've done a number of orders, and just 2 examples. At the end of 2017, we passed an order that allows for carriers to block obviously illegal calls. This is the first time that we made it clear to carriers that if what looks like an obviously illegal call, they're allowed to block it. And how do we know it's obviously illegal? It might be because the caller ID is to an unassigned number, so like an area code that doesn't exist, or that would be unallocated, unassigned. The carrier has the number, but they know no customer has it. Or an interesting one is do not originate. Scammers have looked in the phone book, taken the telephone numbers for the IRS or the Social Security Administration, and then they start making calls, setting their caller ID to that telephone number. And then, the caller ID network dutifully says, this is a call from the IRS. And if they look at the number, they can look it up. Wow, it's the IRS. So I really ought to give them my tax payment in prepaid iPhone cards. You might laugh at that, but it wasn't funny. To the tune of over $70 million, American consumers were bilked to fraudulent schemes. As well, we did just recently an order on disconnected numbers, and basically protecting legal callers from bothering consumers with newly assigned numbers. I would have thought that that wasn't an issue, but then I got a new phone here at the FCC and my phone was ringing off the hook from debt collectors. The other thing we do is convening. So a few years ago, we convened the Robocall Strike Force, and that kicked off the ATIS SIP forum work. We recently concluded a section of the North American Numbering Council, which is a federal advisory committee. They had a work group working on basically the nuts and bolts of deploying stir and shake, and it was industry-led. The FCC accepted the recommendation, which sees us having deployment during 2019. As well, Commissioner Rosenworcel recently announced the results of some letters she sent out, and she found that most of the industry is giving away robocall mitigation solutions to their customers for free. The chairman sent out a set of letters a few weeks ago and basically asking carriers where they are with Shaken and Stir deployment, and found that most of the largest carriers will be deploying in early 2019. And as well, the Enforcement Bureau and I jointly sent out letters to carriers for them to encourage them to participate in traceback. I'm going to touch on that a little bit later. But we do more than rulemaking. We did close to $250 million in fines during 2018, and that includes the largest civil forfeiture fine the FCC has ever done in its 80-year history. And that was to a robocaller to the tune of $120 million. So what do we expect since the deployment of Stir and Shaken has been industry-led? The shutdown obviously will not affect the deployment timeline. We do expect to see major carriers using Shaken and Stir on interconnect by mid-year. This has twofold importance. One is the obvious one. That is, basically without Stir and Shaken, you cannot trust caller ID. Caller ID is one of the inputs to call analytics engines to decide whether a call is wanted or not. Clearly, the confidence in that calculation shoots up dramatically if we have a tested or cryptographically signed caller ID. And again, Jim's going to get into the nuts and bolts of that in a minute. But perhaps not as obvious, and by the way, it's why I'm glad to see so many people on the call that are from state attorney generals or police or consumer protection agency, is that in my personal opinion, the best remediation for robocalling is hunting down and prosecuting these criminals. As you'll learn later in the webinar, Stir and Shaken dramatically reduces the time to find these miscreants and those who aid and abet them. So while the FCC can only issue fines, we really want to help our law enforcement partners find them, prosecute them, convict them, and better than a fine, put them in jail. I'm also happy to see some of our Canadian counterparts on the call. I will begrudgingly admit that the CRTC beat us to the punch. Their Stir, Shake, and mandate for deployment is now just a few weeks away. Besides their leadership, their participation highlights that robocalling is an international issue. It's not just a US domestic issue. As such, we're looking forward to a number of international cooperation activities coming up shortly. On a final note, before I came to the commission, a number of people from industry kind of whispered in my ear saying, wow, the only way we're going to get stir and shake and deployed is if we have a mandate, similar to what Canada has done. I'm happy to say that so far, for the most part, most of industry has responded to the chairman's leadership and have basically indicated that they will be doing early deployment of stir and shake in this year. However, for those carriers who are waiting on the sidelines, you might be aware that certain things are working their way through Congress, which, by the way, if you read that stuff, you'll notice that it says, well, we won't need punitive regulation if industry happens to voluntarily deploy. So one might not be surprised if laggard carriers find themselves in an extreme competitive disadvantage if they don't deploy in a timely manner. So with that, I'm very happy to see the number of participants we have today. And again, want to thank ATIS for convening this webinar. And I hope that once you learn the technology, you'll see how it could help you in your law enforcement or your efforts to protect your customers as we roll out stir and shaken during 2019. So with that, I do want to hand it over to Jim McEachern, who will get down into the nuts and bolts of the technology.
Thank you, Eric, for that nicely setting up the problem. I'm going to jump straight in. What I'm going to cover today in this is going a little bit more detail to the problem statement, more of a technology perspective around the problem statement than the industry perspective that Eric outlined. I'm going to talk about the difference between stir and shaken. Everyone sees typically them together with a slash between them. There is a difference between them, and I'll get into that. And then I want to get into the shaken protocol, the functional elements, some of the details around attestation and RGD, and then try to show how that looks in a network scenario. So start with the problem. A lot of times when I present this, people will say, well, like, why is this a problem? I mean, if I take a case here where I'm making a call with my mobile phone, it authenticates with the network. The service provider knows the number. In fact, the service provider inserts the number in the call signaling across the network. If I've got a landline, it's even more tethered to the network, quite literally tethered via a copper wire to the network, so that again, the service provider knows exactly who's calling. Why is this even a problem? Well, the problem is that if you go into the enterprise market, where carriers where enterprises have a PBX that they've deployed, they're in fact allowed to insert the caller ID, and there are a number of valid reasons for that, and it's been happening since the beginning of SS7 signaling and even before then. And the service provider typically, almost exclusively, doesn't actually check the number that's inserted. It doesn't say that it's wrong. They just don't look, and they just pass it along. So when you get to the terminating end here, some of the calls coming in have been inserted by the network, some haven't. You don't know how to differentiate between them. Now, in this case, you see here, it's relatively not a problem 20, 30 years ago, because these PBXs were expensive pieces of equipment and expensive to connect to the network. So there was a certain problem with them being used for abuse. But if we fast forward to today, you can get an IP PBX. You can get open source code for that IP PBX for free. You can go on to Amazon and you can buy a card that will plug into your computer, and we'll hook that up to the network, either via PRI or an IP connection to the network for a relatively low connection fee. The cards, last time I looked, it was under $1,000 for the card, and you're up in business. And those calls appear to originate locally. The problem is they appear to originate locally, but behind the scenes, you don't know where the actual agent is. And if that actual agent is down the hall or around the world, there's absolutely no way for the service provider and the network to differentiate between those. It's invisible to the network. Now, you notice here I said that the call appears to originate locally. That's actually not quite true. For all intents and purposes, the call actually does originate locally onto the PSTN network. And so when you look at a lot of the calls, robocalling problems you're having, the scams, where it's clear that the agents are not in the country, they're often using a configuration like this. And they use that not so much to hide the fact that they're not originating the calls locally. They do that because it's way cheaper. To use the internet to connect to that PBX, it costs a fraction of a cent per minute, whereas if you initiate an international call, anyone who knows who's traveled internationally, it costs a lot more money. So that's why we had the problem. And when you go into typical network deployments, you don't have a single service provider, you have the connection going through multiple service providers. It gets even harder to work out exactly what's going on and to hide it. So that's kind of why it's a problem. Now, there's one other thing I want to highlight here is we all talk about calls being verified. And I'm showing a situation here where the call is coming from a DC number. And sure enough, it's verified, and it actually is from that. And it's got a check mark because it's verified coming from that number. That tells you something, but it doesn't tell you everything, because even when the number is verified and is actually coming from that number, it doesn't say it's a good person making the call. And so there's a difference between verified and good. They are not the same thing. And we need to keep that in mind when we look at it and we display it to the users and we talk about calls being verified. That is not the same as saying they're a good call. Now, that kind of paints the picture and the things that we were aware of as the IP&I task force started looking at Shake. And I just want to highlight some of the key insights that we realized and came to as we were trying to work out, okay, how can we move forward in this? And one of the key things here really is that the originating carrier always knows something about the origination of the call. In the examples I gave, if it's a mobile phone, if it's a landline, they know exactly the number that's calling, and they in fact are the ones that insert it. Even in the case of a PBX and an enterprise customer, they actually know the customer typically, and they know the location, and that can be very useful information in the case of traceback and identifying people who are abusing the system, as Eric pointed out. However, there are other times where they just know the entry point where it comes into the network because it came from another network, and they don't know anything beyond that. The problem really today is that even though that originating service provider knows something about the network, about the call, which might be very useful, they have no way to let the terminating carrier know what they know and to communicate that reliably to them. So at the origin, you could do all kinds of clever things. When you get to where the call terminates, you can't anymore. And the whole objective for Shaken quite literally was to provide a mechanism for that originating service provider to take the information that they had, the stuff they knew, and to communicate that securely to the terminating service provider so that they could then make a more informed decision about the call and what to do with it. And it's important because the key thing here is nothing more. That when we quite consciously set out to have very focused, in many ways limited objectives so that it could be practical and we could get on with it and it would do some good rather than trying to solve world hunger. Now, let's talk about stir versus shaken. So when we look at stir, I'm going to rewind to as Shaken was, or before Shaken started, and stir predated Shaken, and stir was looking at a way that you could create a digital signature at the origin of a call and you could transmit it to the termination. However, their focus was generally kind of in this space where they were looking at the end devices and having the users get the software, install the software, get the certificate, manage the certificate, and such. And that was generally the scope of stir. And when we began in the IP&I task force to look at this, we concluded that if your solution was going to require that the end users get that software, keep it up to date, get the certificate, make sure it's renewed appropriately, it was going to be a long time before you had a widely deployed solution. And so we decided to focus on the service provider, taking advantage of the fact, hence the Shaken, taking advantage of the fact that the service provider does in fact know something about the caller, and if we can provide a way for them to communicate that to the terminating service provider, that will actually do some good and be very deployable. And so, as you can see here, these two domains don't intersect, don't overlap in any way, shape, or form. And so since what we were deploying was not shaken, we concluded it was not stir, sorry, we concluded it had to be called shaken. And if you look at the acronym, you can pretty quickly work out that we came up with the answer and then worked out how to get that. And as a result, we have a rather tortured acronym. Now, the good news is that that's how we started, but very quickly, the parties got together and they said, you know, we could bring these together and we could merge these two proposals. And so all that differentiation disappeared. And what you then ended up with was STIR becomes a protocol. And you can use that protocol to create a digital signature in a number of places, in the devices, in the network, we don't care. And you can verify it the same way. And then Shaken said, okay, if you take that protocol and you apply it in the service provider network, these are the rules that you will follow to provide that. And that focuses on deployability and security in that service provider context. So they come together, but there's a clear difference between the two of them. So hopefully that helps clear that up. So with that out of the way, that then comes down to the essence of Shaken, again, focused on deployment in the service providers. And as I've outlined before, it creates that digital signature, and it takes what the originating service provider knows about the call, and it then puts that into the digital signature. And that could be A, where they know the customer and the right to use the number. It could be B, you know the customer, but I haven't looked at the number. It doesn't say it's wrong, just I haven't looked, I haven't checked, or just the point where it enters the network. And then the ORIG ID, I'll talk about that in a little bit more, but that is used for reputation and for the traceback that again, that Eric highlighted. And then, of course, it defines how you create that digital signature and then how you verify it at the termination. So now I'm going to go into some of the nuts and bolts of the protocol. At a very high level, I'm not going to get into quite literally the bits and bytes, but hopefully try to give you a sense of it. So the Shaken specification was published in January of 2017. It outlined the mechanism for creating the digital signature. The AS is the authentication service, the mechanism for verifying that, that's the verification service, and then of course how you encode that on the wire so you can get it from the origination to the termination. That all comes from the ATIS specification that we have here. I've got the next couple slides have quite a few words on them, but I think it's important to step back and to give you a sense of what exactly it is that we're claiming in Shaken. And this all comes directly from the specification. And I encourage you to look at that if you want to get the details, but these words are taken directly from it. So in the attestation, the full attestation or A-level attestation you hear people talking about, what you're actually saying is that you as the originating service provider are responsible for originating the call. It's your customer. You have a direct authenticated relationship with that customer, and you can identify them. That's an important thing because a key thing of this is if someone is abusing the system and causing problems, you want to be able to identify them and punish them and stop them. And it also shows that you have a verified association with the telephone number that's used for the call. Now, look at that wording. That is actually not saying that the call is coming from the phone number that you see. What it's saying is the person making that call has a legitimate right to use that phone number. In other words, Shaken allows you to spoof the call if you have a legitimate right to spoof the call. And there are many scenarios where there's a legitimate right to use to spoof the numbers. One that I've heard a number of times is the vet, who on the weekend gets an emergency call, someone has a problem with their pet. Do I wait for Monday or do I rush them to the emergency room to be looked at to be operated on? And they get the message, they return the call. They don't want the personal phone number to appear. They want the office number to appear. And so they're just one of many numbers where there's a legitimate right to spoof. And Shaken allows that as long as you have established that they do in fact have that legitimate right to spoof the number. Now, of course, how do they decide? Well, it's ultimately up to the service provider. But if they put too loose of constraints and they start allowing bad guys in, it will impact the reputation. In due course, the SEC, FTC, and others will show up the door and explain to them that they're not supposed to do that. So reputation is a key part of that. With partial attestation, B that you hear about, that is still you're originating the call, still you have a direct authenticated relationship with the customer, which would be very useful for tracing back if there's a problem, but you have not established a verified relationship with the telephone number. That doesn't say this is not the number it's coming from. It might actually be the number. It just says, I didn't check. I don't know if it's coming from that number. And in that case, that's where you have the ORIG-ID, the unique origination identifier, that essentially assigns a serial number, you can think of it as, to the call, which helps with that trace back to identify the calls that may be causing problems and to contribute to developing a reputation. And I'll say a bit more about the ORIG-ID in the next slide. Gateway attestation, or C, just basically says, I don't know anything about the call other than this is where it entered by network. That can still be valuable for traceback. It doesn't get you all the way to the origin, but it gets you closer and very quickly, and that can be useful. But you're signing for what it is you know. And if you don't know much about the origin, well, then you can't sign that much. Now, I got a lot of words on here. I apologize, but some key concepts, which you can read later if you want, but the ORIG-ID is a unique identifier and it's an opaque identifier. And the reason for a unique identifier is you want to have something that can be assigned to the call or the class of customer. And if you look at the case of a partial attestation, it's identified with a single customer, sometimes even a single customer location. And you want that so you don't have a half dozen customers on the same building that all get assigned the same ORIG-ID, and there's one problem scammer in that building that affects the reputation of all the customers. So you want to have something that identifies a customer uniquely so that the reputation is only associated with them, and if there's a problem, you know which customer address to send the authorities to fix it. The reason for the opaque identifier is you didn't want to have an ORIG-ID that would allow you to reverse engineer the customer just based on the, you want to ensure that the terminating service provider could not identify the customer just based on what they saw in the ORIG-ID. And you want that, again, for personal identifiable information. If you need to identify the customer, then you go to the authorities, they go to the originating service provider, they can do that association, and you can get the person, but only when it's legal and legitimate. That also avoids giving away competitive information, so that you couldn't work out that, ooh, there's a lot of really good calls coming from this location. I think I should send my salespeople around to knock on the door. It's unique, but it's opaque, so that only the originating service provider can identify that when necessary. Now, obviously, if you look at this, that's going to lead to the need for best practices. We have some ideas now. I'm sure that those will evolve as we get operational experience and we decide how to best use that to meet the full objectives. Okay, that's enough of the words. I apologize for that, but there's some important concepts in there that I wanted to highlight. So I want to talk about the shaken functions now and how they appear in the network and what it means. So I've got the authentication service I talked about and the verification service, and I'm going to use that to show how it works in a network scenario. So here we have a case of partial or full attestation. You have two networks. They're both SIP-based IMS networks. They're interconnected via IP, and at the origin, you authenticate the call. At the termination, you can verify it, and then you get end-to-end shaken authentication. And that would apply whether it's full or partial attestation. It goes end-to-end across two or more networks, however many networks, as long as they're all IMS or SIP-based, and as long as they have IP interconnection between them. If you have another case where you have one SIP-based network, but you have another network that's TDM or SS7, a legacy network, that doesn't support shaken, and therefore you still do the verification of termination, but now you can only put the originate shaken at the gateway, and so you get gateway attestation. Again, it helps you trace back to closer to the origin, but not all the way to the origin. Now, I've got a couple examples that show how the origination identifier actually would work in practice in the network, and illustrate how you can use this to identify, both to develop a reputation and to identify problem callers when they exist. So in this case, we have two customers, enterprise customers. They're both going to get partial attestation, and the first one gets that, it goes across the network. The second one goes across the network. The calls are coming in, and they're all verified with partial attestation. There's nothing to differentiate between them. When we add, and we take that information and we feed that into an analytics service, however, it begins to analyze it and look at complaints it gets, and over time it determines that this location actually is generating a lot of calls. It might be because there's a miscreant in there that's trying to scam people. It might be because their PBX was hacked and they need to identify it. It doesn't matter, it identifies that. Now, that's great that you can do that. The problem is this is not what you see at the terminating network or at the analytics when this happens. What you actually see is this, where the calls are coming into your network, and at the analytics, you've got a bunch of calls coming in. Some are good, some are bad. It's not really easy to differentiate which are which until you add in the origination identifier, the orig ID, and suddenly it becomes clear that you have a number of calls. All the calls coming in with orig ID 1 are problematic, and with orig ID 2 they're good, and therefore you can now give those bad calls a bad reputation and identify them as scam likely or whatever to the users. You can also alert the authorities if appropriate and help and initiate a traceback, a very quick traceback, to send people to resolve the problem at the source. Now, I'll point out that in this case, that the thing that allowed you to differentiate quickly between the good and the bad calls was the analytics function. If you take that away, you're back to where you started. You've got some calls with orig ID 1 and some with 2, but you can't quickly identify the good and the bad calls. Now, if you do by other means, filing complaints, police work, investigation, you determine that all these calls that the calls coming in from 1 were in fact bad, and you launch an investigation. At that point, it becomes very quick to identify, or very easy to identify the source of those as coming from there. And if you go back to this service provider 1 here, you can identify, he can tell you exactly where to go and where to identify the problem. Today, you can do that traceback, but it's a much more semi-automated process that takes a lot of time. This would be very automated. So even without analytics, the RIGD can still be very useful for traceback, but where it becomes extremely powerful is when it helps you to develop the reputation very quickly. That hopefully gives you some flavor for the essence of Shaken and what it can do. We're also looking at potential future webinars that might go into additional detail. One's around Shaken governance, basically how you manage and govern that structure, the distribution of certificates, the security, who gets certificates, all those kinds of things, the whole governance structure, plus efforts that we have underway to set that up. We are looking at another one. ATIS and Newstar have basically had a Shaken testbed available for some time now to the industry, allowing people to bring their implementations in, test them in a real network scenario, and ensure that they're working and interoperable. We can give an update on that. And also the display framework, alternatives and trade-offs, how you decide what you display to the end user, what you display to the end user if it's gone through analytics that's identified the bad guys, what you display to the end user if you just have the verification function done, and again, what are the pros and cons. There's no industry consensus on that yet, but understanding the alternatives and trade-offs might be useful. So we just sent you a poll. I would encourage you to complete that and let us know if you're interested in the results of one or more of those. And with that, I'll turn it back to you, Brent, to see if we've had any questions.
Great, thank you, Jim. Thank you, Eric, for that. Very much appreciated. We do have a number of questions, and so I'll start with the first one we got was, and this may well be for Eric as much as it is for Jim. How would reassigned number database mitigate robocall? The question is asked because he says most robocalls originate as from spoofed or valid telephone numbers.
Yeah, and that's actually a really good question in that, you know, when most people think of robocalls, they think of illegal robocalls, many of which, in fact, may be sourced outside of the country. But it's actually a much larger issue, and there are businesses that do use legal automated call systems, such as pharmacies or doctor's offices, letting you know that you have a prescription ready or appointment reminders. And so the disconnected numbers database, what that's about, and why I said it affected me personally, I got a new phone here at the FCC, and sure enough, someone was registered to get notifications, but they changed their phone number. So to me, you know, the new holder, I'm thinking, boy, this is a robocall. Not only is it a robocall, it must be illegal because I didn't give permission to let them call me. The flip side is the people calling me, they don't want to bother me. They want to get to their customer. So they're kind of put out, and it's costing them money because they're wasting a call. And in fact, sometimes they've got liabilities for it. And I'm upset because I'm getting, you know, what I think is a regular robocall. So, you know, is that item going to, you know, reduce the, you know, billions of robocalls? Not really, but it's, you know, one of the things that's kind of a step in the right direction.
Yeah, Eric, if I can just add to that, I agree with what you said. I think the thing I would emphasize is that when we look at addressing robocalling from the beginning, we've concluded that this is going to be a complex problem that's going to require a layered approach and multiple technologies to address it. And in that context, I think the reassigned number database is an important piece of the puzzle that will fit nicely into the broader picture. By itself, it does some things, but it doesn't solve it in any way, shape, or form.
Okay, thank you. Next question is, what if the originator of the call legitimately uses a different number, perhaps a number belonging to another carrier? How does the originating carrier recognize the legitimacy of the call? So
I will tackle that. So one of the interesting things about Shaken as it's done by itself is it allows for the service provider to do any means that they have, any other means to verify that this customer well and truly has a right to use a number. Now, clearly, as you're pointing out, that if that number was assigned by a different service provider, then that becomes a difficult problem to do in practice, even though you can do it in theory. And one of the things that we're working on and is nearing completion in the IPNA task force is something that we call TN-POP, or TN telephone number proof of possession, that basically is a mechanism that would allow you as a user who gets a number from service provider A to get a certificate from service provider A that proves that you're entitled to use that phone number. And then when you use that certificate to originate the call to service provider B, that proves to service provider B that you do well and truly have the right to use that phone number. Again, the TM-POP would warrant a whole presentation in its own right, but basically it's a mechanism that allows you to, the service provider that owns a phone number to essentially delegate to the user something that allows them to prove to a different service provider that this actually is their number. And then once it gets into that other service provider network, it just works like the rest of Shaken. So hopefully that gives you a sense of it. You know, again, that's nearing completion. That will not cover every scenario where the numbers are delegated because you get into some very complex scenarios, but I think it will be an important extension to the basic shaking capabilities.
Thank you. I do have a question specifically for Eric. Why do you think the number of complaints to the FTC DNC do not call list dropped from fiscal year 17 to fiscal year 18?
I have no idea. As in, I haven't looked into it yet. I'd ask the FTC folks. I mean, I'd love to say it's because of all the great work we've done, but you know, that let them do their analysis.
I think we're going to stick with it because all of the great work you've done. Question is Shake and Stir supported for 911 calls? Jim, I think that's probably your area.
Yes, but we haven't done, I haven't been involved in extensive analysis for that. Let me just think about this. Yeah, no, there's no reason why it wouldn't be. A 911 call is just like any other call, and the person originating the call, again, if from a given device you're making a call to your cousin or you're making a call to 911, it would be able to be authenticated and the digital signature created in exactly the same way. When it gets to 911, as long as it has an IP connection and it has implemented the verification, that would work as well. So you know, generally yes. Guess that was kind of
actually, I will jump in on this one, Brent. You know, the FCC does not have jurisdiction over, you know, what public safety answering points the 911 call centers do with their calls. What we would hope is that Stir and Shaken will help, again, not necessarily solve, but help ameliorate issues of like swatting or doing telephone denial of service attacks against 911 centers. So one could imagine not necessarily that, you know, if a call fails, the attestation that it gets blocked, but that the call center, you know, gets notified of that the number that's being presented might not be the actual number of the caller. And, you know, that becomes important, like in the swatting scenario where you don't want to send the SWAT team, you know, where it would be not warranted by the actual circumstance.
Thank you. How does Shaken work for calls that might be IP on either end but pass through a TDM tandem?
It doesn't. Is a short answer. If you switch back to TDM partway through, it shreds the end-to-end signature. So basically, it would terminate at the tandem, and then it would generate a new, what now would be gateway at the origin. Again, yeah, it doesn't.
Okay.
And one could imagine that, and Brent, one could imagine that, you know, as you choose interconnect providers that are not supporting end-to-end Stir Shaken, and if the receiving carriers start saying, hey, you know, most of the traffic we get is signed, but, you know, traffic from this source isn't, you know, the market may pressure either upgrades or choices of carriers that are more modern.
Great, thank you. And Jim, if you want me to deal with this one, I'll be happy to do it. What is the status for the RFP for the selection of the SPI-CA, they said, for USA and for Canada? I think they might be talking about the SPI-PA, but we might have to describe the difference between the two. Do you want to take that question, or would you rather I jump on that?
I'm going to actually take some of the context of the question and let you take the specific question. So
okay.
The first thing I'll highlight is that you're right. It's we've got the PA, or the policy administrator, and then you've got the CA, or the certification authority. The next step in this process is selecting policy administrators. that will not be a policy administrator for Canada and the US. There will be a policy administrator for Canada, and there will be a policy administrator for the US, because numbering resources numbers are national resources by international treaty, and so each country will control that. The other point is that once the policy administrator is set up, then we will allow a number of certification authorities to basically get approved and participate in that. So the CA bit of it is a competitive space, and that will happen as soon as you have PAs in each of the countries. And with that, I'll hand back to you, Brent, to talk about the status of selecting a policy administrator in the US.
Thanks, Jim. The SCIGA has issued an RFP for a policy administrator. Those RFP responses are due on February 4th. We hope to have those evaluated and have a STIPA, the policy administrator, in place at some point this year, likely July. So that's all I've got on that. I can't say anything for Canada. That's just for the US. Okay. The next question is, can a valid number that has been spoofed by a robocaller ever be blocked? Jim, I think I'll let you handle that one.
Well, I mean, I'll tackle that. Let's back up here. Can a valid number that's been spoofed by a robocaller? So, shaken. The thing I'm hesitating on is can it be blocked, and whether or not you're allowed to block is something that's determined by the FCC regulations, which I believe currently would not allow that. Although Eric, I'll allow you to jump in if I've got it wrong.
I'll let you finish answering, and then I'll tell you what's on deck.
Yeah, and the other caveat is it's important to distinguish between a call that is blocked by the carrier that has obligations to deliver calls versus a call that's blocked by one of the various call blocking analytic services. And the key thing there is that when you sign up for an analytic service, you're signing up and asking that service to, under certain conditions, block calls on your behalf. And of course, once you essentially, under those, it's like you as a user have delegated the blocking of them, and that's between you and the service that you sign up to do that. So it kind of depends on the context. I'll tend to you, Eric, because a whiteboard would help answer these things.
That's right, and Jim did hit like the key. You know, we care deeply about concerns about any competitive behavior. We care deeply that all carriers' traffic is supposed to be common carriage, treated equally. We also believe deeply in consumer choice. So there are people out there who say, I'm a legal automated caller. We want the FCC to make sure that the called party answers. Well, I don't think anybody would like it if we said you have to get the call that you don't want. So for illegal calls, we, with the blocking report and order, and you can see other stuff that's going to be coming down the pipe, if it's clearly illegal, the carrier is allowed to block it. The reverse of that is, consumers have choice, and if consumers subscribe to services that on behalf reject unwanted calls as well as likely illegal calls, that's consumer choice. We are working on items that hopefully will be able to, give carriers more confidence in rejecting unwanted calls by giving legitimate callers redress mechanisms where if their call is blocked, they have the opportunity to get it unblocked. And likewise, my understanding of the industry is that most of the analytics engines, especially today, where we don't really, have total confidence in caller ID, it's not a, one strike and you're out. We see an illegal call from that number, we block it, because the illegal callers are using real numbers. So irrespective of our rules that say you can't just willy-nilly block numbers, most of the analytics engines will look at overall call patterns and not just block a call because it once had a bad call.
Okay, thank you. I actually had a question about the traced bill, TRACED bill, the Thune-Markey-Wicker bill. How will the bill affect what the industry is doing now, and how will the FCC react to the bill if it's actually passed? And maybe, Eric, that's more your territory.
Yeah, well, I cannot speak for the FCC, short of what kind of everyone knows. We are a commission, which means we answer to Congress. If Congress tells us to do something, we'll do it. I would encourage people to look at the Trace Act. It does some important things for the state attorney generals who are on the call. One of the problems we've had historically is the time it takes to do traceback. And one of the provisions in the bill right now extends the statute of limitations, which is a very important change. The second part increases the penalties, but again, would love to work with you in your efforts to actually do more than just fine these people. But the third one, it's the act, it's in the bill is in two parts. One basically says there's going to be a stir, shake, and mandate. The other part says, unless of course industry voluntary does it. So I would strongly encourage industry to do their best to make that part of the act moot.
Thank you. Jim, do you have anything on that, or you want to go to the next question?
Next question.
Next question, okay. What fields will be used to verify certificate revocation?
Okay, that was a very specific question that I think has a more general answer. The way we're handling, well, we're in the final stages of putting the text in for provision for certificate revocation, but basically we'll have a certificate revocation list that will be distributed to the originating service providers, so they will have the ability to check if certificates have been revoked. That having been said, we put that in just because it's good practice. That having been said, given that certificates are under this system only going to relatively large entities, service providers who if they abuse the system and do illegal things, it will be easy to find them and punish them, and to stop that. Setting up a service provider and using it for fraud until you're shut down isn't the kind of thing you can do on an easy basis. We actually believe that there will be relatively few instances of the need for certificate revocation. So it's not something we see as a critical part, but obviously we've included it as a best practice for certificates. And that's where we're finalizing the document that will specify how that's done as we speak. So I think it's out for letter ballot right now.
Okay. We're getting close to our end of our time. We're going to take at least one more question. We'll see how quickly it gets answered. We may have time for two. Let's see. Is there a difference between what the carriers are saying they're implementing today, such as T-Mobile and Comcast have said I think they've started to sign calls already, and what the STIGA is trying to put in place later this year?
Yeah, that's a good question. So what they are deploying today is exactly shaken. However, given that the policy administrator and the certification authorities have not been set up, today what is being used are self-signed certificates. And again, we recognize that you would probably need to begin in the early stages with self-signed certificates. Obviously, that is not going to be the long-term solution, because self-signed certificates create opportunities for abuse and for fraud. But the thinking is that you do that, use those self-signed certificates, you probably just use them within your own network, while you're deploying the system, getting some operational experience, make sure everything works. And by the time you get to the stage where you expand that into wider deployments and into working with other service providers, the policy administrator and the certification authorities are set up later this year, and then it just naturally transitions to that. So what's being deployed now is limited scope. It's proving, it's getting operational experience. It will later this year naturally transition into exactly what the GA is setting up.
Thanks, Jim. And I think we're going to do one more question because I think it allows us to, well, mark it for one of the next webinars. But the last question I want to hit, are there are currently no guidelines on how the smartphone should display. How do we educate customers on what number, if a number has been passed the validation, if a number's failed the validation, how do we tell carriers, scam likely? When one carrier has scam likely and another has failed says failed the validation, how do we educate customers on how they can tell if a call has been validated or not?
Yeah, excellent question. And if you have the answer, please give me a call and we should talk further. A little bit more seriously. I mean, this is a very difficult problem. There are risks of holding back and not displaying everything you know to the consumer. There are risks of going forward too quickly and displaying things that turn out to be confusing. I talked about there's a difference between verified and good kind of thing. There is no industry consensus yet on the best way forward for that. I think a picture is beginning to emerge, but that is actively being debated in the IPNI task force and in a related group that initiated at SIPNOC in December that's trying to get our head around that and provide good guidance, because it is a very important question. But again, there isn't an industry consensus yet, although we're working hard on that. I don't know, Eric, if you have anything to add, but I think it's a difficult problem, which is why there's no consensus yet.
That's right. Although I think I can't speak for the FCC, but we don't do user interfaces. You raise another good point. Is that there are limits to how far you can go in the best practices, because the people who manufacture smartphones, they kind of jealously guard that user interface, and the people who do analytics similarly jealously guard it. That doesn't mean that there can't be some good guidance in terms of what is displayed and a good understanding for some consistency as well, but we have to approach it carefully. And if people are interested, that is, as you said, Brent, one of the topics that we identified as a potential for a deeper dive into some of the pros and cons and issues and challenges. And that answers that, and I'll hand it back to you, Brent, I think, for a wrap-up.
Yep, wrap up is it. We're at our time. We want to thank everybody for attending. Thank everyone for all your questions. Eric and Jim, thank you for all the information. We will, of course, be sending out a link to the slides and to the recording of this webinar to everybody who's registered. Feel free to send that on, or send the link on to everybody else that you think might be interested. We'll also be sending out information again for the next webinar in the series, which, while we haven't picked a date yet, should be no more than probably a few weeks out or a couple of weeks out. So we're looking to have these fairly regularly if we can. Again, thank you everybody for attending, and have a great day.